So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to improvise this. Someone had a question about open form versus closed form. And basically, closed form is anything that is fairly rigid in its structure, like a haiku or a sonnet. There are literally hundreds and hundreds. There's a whole book written about the various forms of poetry. Um, if you want to think about it in practical terms, um, when they pour concrete, they pour it into a form because concrete is mushy and slushy and wants to go everywhere into a big puddle. But if you put wooden forms up around it to contain it, then you can create a slab and you can build a house on a slab. So a lot of people regard closed forms as solid structures that will last forever. And in a way, they're true. It's true because sonnets, think of Shakespeare's sonnets, have lasted for a long time, and some people attribute it to the fact that the sonnet is a rigid form, and that Shakespeare was working within it, but he was also stretching the boundaries of it at the same time. So that's the kind of the difference between closed form and open form. Open form is actually no less constrained. In other words, it has form as well. It's just that the form it takes has a lot more flexibility. It could stretch into a circle or a triangle or whatever you want. And a lot of modern poetry in the 20th century was about pushing back against closed forms and actually you know, wanting to create new forms. So when I talk about reading the text, this is one of the most important things that you can read in our text because there are tools not only in the text, but there are also tools in the checklist. And sometimes the tools in the checklist mirror the tools in the form. So when you are doing the checklist, you want to be able to know what free verse is and to recognize it when you see it and describe it and just know what open form is. So if your poem is open form, like mine is, the poem Power is open form. You know that it is. And you'll know that the breaks in the lines, in other words, when where the line stops and goes to the next line, that's a break, has significance. It's important. And that's what the second thing I want you to do here is to explain how the line breaks contribute to the meaning in the poem. And that's what I'm doing in my poem right now. I'll show an example of this and I'll demonstrate it. I'm kind of going all over the poem looking at the line breaks in a different way. Normally, I probably wouldn't look at the line breaks. I'd just consider this is a story about a railroad engine that was stopped and the railroad conductor cried and the kids didn't know they could do it and, etc. It's more like a short story. But when the poet starts to use the tricks of the trade, like where to break the line, then the poet is doing that on purpose. And it's probably doing it to point us towards a larger vision of the poem. In my case, the larger vision is it's a poem about writing poetry and about the power of poetry and how poets can influence their reader, maybe secretly, maybe unconsciously, sort of like advertising. One of the things they talk about in here is prose poetry, as a way to, that's one of the ways that free verse has worked to break down the boundaries between poetry and fiction. We had a question about a granary elevator of a poem by Robert Bly in our first test of the semester. That was pushing against the definition of poetry into prose poetry. And of course, if you have an open form, then you want to know how free verse plays a role in that meaning. And I have at least 2 examples and probably 4 or 5 more, which I won't use all of them, but I will use them as examples to prove my point in the thesis for my explication. Let's take a quick look at Denise Levertoff's poem, Ancient Stairway, Footsteps like water hollow, the broad curves of stone, ascending, descending, century by century. Who can say if the last to climb these stairs will be journeying downward or upward? This is an open form free verse poem, and it's interesting. It's talking about going up and down steps. So, you might think, if you look along right here, this whole thing right here, it sort of looks like steps. You go up and you go down, you go up and you go down. And in this case, you go down, 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 up, down, down, up. So, she may actually be answering the question here at the end. Is it upward or downward? Well, it just all depends. Depends on whether you think this shape of the poem, and the shape of the poem is something that you can do when you use free verse. You're not limited to how long the line is, like in a sonnet. It has 5 measures, 10 total beats. And if you want to stick with the rules, then you can't do anything that Denise Levertoff did here. If you look at the line breaks always lend some sort of emphasis. So hollow, it breaks here, so it stops. And then, so that means that it's lending some emphasis to the broad curves of stone. So, this is a common thing. You see it on the steps of Cherry Hall. You see it in steps in any building that's more than 50 years old, and the building is actually made of something worthwhile. That footsteps eventually will make little hollows into the actual stone steps. And in this case, she compares footsteps to water. They slowly wear it down and slowly wear it down until it hollows it out. Upwards and downwards, century by century. And there are lots of places where there are lots of what they call pilgrimages and ancient sites, religious sites, both pagan and Christian, in the United Kingdom, where you'll see this. You'll see the stones are simply worn out from people going up and down the mountain, for example, like Glastonbury. So look at the line endings on your poem and see if they make any sense. If it's a free verse poem, if it's an open form poem. Also, slight pauses. So these slight pauses, it's obvious that the writer wanted you to do something, to maybe stop a little bit. Normally, when you have the period, that's a full stop. But the ends of each of these lines are all pauses. And their pause, there's a reason for that. So you've got to figure out what it might be as it relates to the larger meaning of the poem. For me, I've got to figure out where the pauses are in my poem and ask if the poet meant for that to mean something. Of course, it might be that the poet is very lax about the line breaks, or it's hard to know sometimes. So in a way, unless you can talk to Denise Levertoff, you can't really know for sure what she's doing. But the idea behind an explication is that you're the one who's creating the meaning. You're the one who's sharing the meaning with other people. If you look at lines 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4, ascending, descending, century by century, the rhythm of that, ascending, descending, going up, coming down, century by century, the repetition of sounds in there, and how it could be the feel of the steps going up and down the ancient stairway. So the emphasis is on ancient stairway because that's a title, and everything inside is supposed to contribute towards the larger meaning of ancient stairway. So, you have to decide what you think the meaning is, and then you have to decide whether these open forms are her decisions that she's made here at the end of each line contribute to that meaning. I think you can make a good argument that it does. This is the kind of thing that you tend to skip over when you're reading a textbook. And you shouldn't, because it tells you what free verse is. The whole key to understanding open forms is free verse. And note here they talk about Denise Levertov right here. And see if I can... who we just talked about. And defining, as we talked about earlier in the semester, is super important. And if your definition is weak or unfocused or unhelpful, then it doesn't lead to understanding. It's a tool for understanding. So again, here's another tool that they point to for analyzing your own verse, your own poem. Okay, another example of analyzing line breaks. We did an earlier one with Denise Levertov. I talked a little bit about mine. You need to just apply these suggestions here. And it's just another sample of a poem. I could read this out loud to you, but part of learning is learning how to pull information out of text and applying it. And that's what mainly the lesson of an explication paper is. How well can you use the tools that are available that we're talking about in the classroom, which should probably give you a hint as to what the final exam might be. Again, this is the text, and it allows you to reflect again on something we mentioned earlier about how sound and rhythm, like in Levertov's poem, is being used. You need to think about sound and rhythm in conjunction with free verse, in conjunction with the open form poem. And one of the ways that you get extra meaning in a free verse open form poem is by using pauses, is by using rhythm, it's by repeating things. Some forms are more open than others. Some are relatively rigid. They kind of invent their own form and call it free verse. And they may have rhymes, but the rhymes are within the poem. Okay, this is the last page of the chapter. And this is how these checklists work. You read the text, you look through it like I did, looking for information, looking for tools. Then at the end here they talk about there's more tools. And what's so great about this textbook is this is, you ask, well, how do I do this checklist? Well, you read the text and then you look very closely at this information. For example, there's all kinds of good advice in these bullet points about how to do the line breaks, how to analyze the line breaks. So if you've got an open form poem, then you're going to have to analyze line breaks and make sure you understand why the poet, or at least think you understand why the poet used the line breaks where they did. Maybe thinking they used it in terms of sound and rhythm or some other thing, or just an idea or concept. So, read through this and see if you can come up with a more sophisticated idea of what a line break is. For example, think about which do all the lines tend to be brief, or are they all long, or is there a mix of things, and why is there a mix of things? Um, and this is the most important one right here, I think, because it gets to the meaning of the poem, which is your whole reason for writing the explication. You're trying to, in a way, you're trying to argue a point about the meaning of the poem. This is worth doing. And so we ask yourself how the poet's choices about line breaks help reinforce the poem's meaning. And I think I'm going to use this analysis in my explication paper because it's worth. I've got at least 3 and probably 5 different areas in here that I can include. Of course, definitions. Having definitions is fantastic. So you know more than what you knew, and again, all of these things are analytical terms. So you're looking at a poem, and you can ask yourself: is this an open form, or is this a closed form? Open form oftentimes tell you it's an older poem, but not always. And sometimes open forms are being experimented with, like the sonnet is being experimented with, or there are experiments with using free verse that looks like prose, or that uses rhyme in a very unconventional way. So, just to let you know, free verse is the way it's done now by most poets. There's still poets who think it's important to develop the skills of writing in sonnets and haiku and all the various tools there are. These definitions are important, and make them your own. And lastly, I think is the checklist. It's so good to finally get to the checklist, and it tells you what to do. Reread the poem, pay attention to where the lines end, ask yourself, do the breaks come at the end of the sentences or phrases? Do they tend to become in the middle of an idea? Some of these will tell you something. Are they long, short? Is there a mix of them? So really what this is a summary of the tools that they talk about in the text. Of course, if you don't know what the line breaks are, and you haven't thought about line breaks in your poem, when most people don't, they just read it and they think, well, that's just the way it is. No, a poem is a very calculated thing. A good poem especially so. Good poems have been written and rewritten and rewritten. I have friends who are published poets who have rewritten a poem 40 or 50 times. And sometimes even then they don't allow the poem to be published because they don't think it's ready. There's something missing, So poets are very careful. Good poets, I should say, are very careful. There's an example. You can take a look at it. This is a really good one because what they do is they turn the poem into more like a paragraph and then ask you some questions. So that's well worth looking at. I'm not going to go through that. And that's it. That's all we got. So I hope this helps. I know it's long, but I did want to address the question that someone had about closed form. Okay, thanks a bunch. Bye-bye.